All right, here we are at lecture 1 for week 2, and today we're going to be talking about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, both of which make drastic changes to the way human beings think about the world around them in such huge ways that we are still dealing with the amazing ramifications of both of these huge movements. And then in our second lecture this week, we'll be talking about the Atlantic revolutions, which directly come out of the Enlightenment. So there's some really great continuity between our two lectures this week. Now, the scientific revolution, as you can see, lasted from roughly 1543 until 1727. The term scientific revolution refers to a new set of beliefs about how the universe developed over a long period of time. Now, as scholars from the Byzantine Empire started to reintroduce Europeans to Plato, Aristotle, and the other great Greek and Roman thinkers, many European thinkers began to look outside of even these Greek and Roman traditions. And eventually, three great scientific pioneers, Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton, will ultimately overturn the descriptive science of Aristotle and Plato and replace it with the mathematical new science, which is the science that you and I are both familiar with today. This new way of thinking about the world was really progressive for its time, in that it allowed a scientist to alter their hypothesis and, through trial and error, to alter the knowledge we had of the world. This concept of trial and error and experimentation for scientists is really part and parcel of what they do today. But it wasn't particularly endorsed by the church for many centuries. The development of new scientific ideas, this revolution, was part of many other movements that are going on at the same time, such as the Enlightenment, which we'll cover later. Now, for some time, Europeans believed that the universe revolved around the Earth. In astronomy, based on Aristotle and Ptolemy, the Earth was at the center of the planetary universe. But this theory began to fall apart, partially due to Nicholas Copernicus. Now, Copernicus studied astronomy at the University of Krakow, later studied at many Italian universities, and he rejected Aristotle's descriptive science of the elements, and with it, he also rejected the idea that the Earth was at the center of the universe. And he exchanged the places of the Earth with the Sun. He's the first one who really points out, no, the Sun is at the center of the universe, a concept that is known as heliocentrism. Now, Copernicus was fortunate in that he lived in a time period in Europe where there was a very tolerant pope. And so, luckily for Nicholas Copernicus, he was not persecuted for his ideas, and as we'll see, that will not be the case with all scientists who are alive during the scientific revolution. Now, during the near century between the birth of Copernicus and then later Galileo, mathematics improved considerably. In 1604, Galileo brought together geometry, algebra, and Archimedean physics. He was a first-rate astronomer and one of the first to use a telescope, which had been, at this point, recently invented in Flanders. By 1609, Galileo had seen through his telescope that the surface of the moon was rough and mountainous. Previous thinking held that the heavens, the planets, were perfect and therefore unchangeable. And Galileo had just proved that wrong using the telescope. Because of his discoveries, he received a substantial endowment appointment as the chief mathematician and philosopher at the Medici court in 1610. Now, overall, Galileo's ideas demanded the acceptance of some very new concepts, that the world around human beings consists of bodies that are subject to mathematical and mechanical laws, and that these can be uncovered by the senses, by observation, by experimentation. The larger universe partakes in these operations because the Earth is a body, like other planets, that moves in a boundless space, and not least due to scriptural texts. So what that means is that Galileo is arguing that the Earth, the way other planets move and how they behave is due to math and science rather than scripture, faith, and the Bible. So at the time, this was a huge deal that he is putting this out there. Now, this fame as well as his ideas attracted the irritation of the church. Now, by the 1600s, the Christian church has split in the Reformation into the Catholic Church and then the Protestant churches, which are everything in the Christian faith that's not Catholicism, basically. So Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, etc. So he mostly is irritating the Catholic Church. He also supported Copernicus's ideas about heliocentrism, which also irritated the church. And the reason why is that this heliocentric idea seemed to contradict Bible passages that argued that the earth was fixed and immovable. So if it moved around the sun and is not the center of the universe, then that Bible passage would be incorrect. And so a lot of people within the church community were really angry about the theory of heliocentrism. Now, by 1600, the Catholic Church in particular had begun to see enemies in a lot of places. They were dealing with the Protestant Reformation, and they kind of felt like enemies were everywhere. And so this is one reason why they take issue with these scientists and mathematicians. Now, Galileo, one of the other reasons why they were so frustrated with him was he was one of the first of these new scientists to appeal to the mass literate audience. Even his friends thought he'd be able to win over the church to these new ideas of heliocentricity and his way of thinking about the universe. But Galileo's showdown with the church brought the new science out of universities, and it really brought it to the attention of elite Europeans. So this is very helpful. But unfortunately for Galileo, unlike Copernicus, he did not live under a tolerant pope and seemed to underestimate the intensity of how much the Catholic Church was irritated with his ideas. In 1632, he was condemned to house arrest, and anything he published after that point had to be smuggled out of Italy and published elsewhere in Europe. And this was a big defeat both for Galileo but for other scientists at the time, and he was forced to publicly denounce the concept of heliocentrism. And this had a chilling impact on scientists in Europe at the time. Patrons of scientists reduced the money they were willing to give, and this meant research declined. During the 1600s, the new science shifted north to France, England, and Germany. In these countries, which were by this point becoming more and more Protestant, there was no single church authority that dominated the way the Catholic Church dominated in Italy. And in France, England, and Germany, this allowed more scientific inquiry and research to occur. It also shows us that the Catholic Church had a significant amount of power to pull this off and to scare so many scientists. But ultimately, this still brought about new scientific ideas and brought these ideas to more people, and people began to ask the question of what science should be and what it should mean. Now, next on our list of important scientists is Isaac Newton. Now, Newton lived in England during a lot of the fighting between the Protestants and the Catholics there. His main contribution to the new science was calculus, which at this point was a brand new field in mathematics. So if you hate calculus, here you go. You can blame Isaac Newton. Later in his career, Newton unified the fields of physics and astronomy, establishing what was called the Newtonian synthesis. His book, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, published in 1687, established a deterministic universe following mathematical rules and formed the basis of science until the early 20th century. Basically, he was arguing, as Galileo had been, that the universe follows mathematical principles, and if you can understand that, you can understand how the universe works. And he actually takes it a step further and says that while many of he and his cohort did believe that God existed, Isaac Newton and many other scientists like him did not think that God was the one propelling the universe. Again, he believed it was fundamental laws of math and physics, and that it was led by an invisible force which Newton called gravity. Now, no, he does not sit under the tree and get hit with an apple and then come up with the idea of gravity. That's an apocryphal story. But he is the one that names that force gravity. So, because he's in England, there isn't as much religious pushback against his ideas, but you can definitely bet the Pope was not on board. But since Newton lived in England, not Italy, the Pope had not any control really over Newton or what he said or published. Now, despite the fact that the Catholic Church's crackdown on scientists had drove scientists north, Italian-style academies gave way to more and more scientific societies, such as the Royal Society of London, the Paris Academy of Sciences. So these are, fancy pants organizations for scientists on any level, even if you're sort of what we might consider to be like an amateur scientist, for them to get together and talk over their ideas. These societies had administrators, scientists. They would challenge each other using scientific questions. They would be awarded prize money for good research. They were able to publish their work. These various different academies had thousands really of members. And many of these members would later go on to become pioneers of science. Now, another impact was the role of literacy and how Europeans were increasingly becoming more and more literate. And so what happens is that they're more and more reading these scientific ideas, being influenced by them, and you start to see, this is when we start to see the beginning of what we now call secular society, a society that is not based on religion. And so more and more of the elite intellectuals are arguing that we can understand the world through math and science rather than through religion. And so you start to see that sort of push, particularly in science, that religion is not how we should be looking at the universe. We should be looking at it through science and math. Now, this is also helped along by textbooks. For the first time, these various societies are publishing textbooks, which, again, with a higher literacy rate, you have more and more people being able to read them. You also have scientists go on traveling lecture circuits where they'll go to coffee houses or homes or salons, and they get to talk about the newest, latest, and greatest technology. Now, one of the other aspects of this, and this ties into our lectures last week on colonization and the Atlantic slave trade, they also will really speak a lot in coffee houses. These were places of intellectual discussion, as we noted in last week's lecture. As I said before, they also are a place where only men would have been able to go, but it definitely would have provided a place for people who were interested to get together, listen to traveling speakers, talk about their ideas. Again, spreading these ideas is so incredibly important. Now, in addition to coffee houses allowing for the spread of these new scientific ideas, was the salon. The salon was a well-furnished, elegant living room space in an urban residence and was both a domestic chamber and a semi-public meeting place for the social elite to gather and talk about really interesting ideas of the time period. And salons would have been open to men and women. The culture of the salons emerged first in Paris in the 1580s, but continued into the 19th century. The French salon became a bastion of well-placed and respected scholars, and it also was a place where female scientists and scholars could express their ideas more freely because they weren't allowed into the coffee house, but you have a lot of female scholars participating in these new ideas nonetheless. All right, so now we're going to turn to talking about the Enlightenment, which is going on at basically the same time, roughly. It goes a little bit later than the scientific revolution, and they're definitely tied together. Now, the period between the 17th century and the end of the 18th century was very important in terms of European intellectual thought. Lots of changes had occurred that would lead not only to a new set of beliefs about the universe, but also to a new set of beliefs about human beings, and ultimately lays the foundation for some of the biggest revolutions in human history. The Enlightenment began to change the way people thought about just about everything, including the way people thought about government, politics, and society. They were inspired by the scientists of the scientific revolution, and they began to think, hey, if traditional ideas about the universe can be questioned and determined mathematically, perhaps other elements of society can be questioned as well. And if we can discover fundamental laws about the nature of the universe, maybe there are fundamental laws about the nature of human beings. And it was this kind of thinking that developed into what we now call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment began as an elite intellectual movement in Europe, but by the end of the 1700s, its values were increasingly adopted by people of different nationalities, classes, and by both genders. Not only that, the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers traveled with Europeans as they began to colonize the Americas, and they were picked up by many colonists through books, letters, and pamphlets. So again, that literacy is very important. By 1770, approximately 3,500 different books and pamphlets were appearing every year in France alone, compared to just 1,000 50 years earlier. By 1776, about 12 million copies of newspapers were circulating in England alone. So again, lots of information out there, lots more people able to read. And even if you couldn't read, oftentimes someone in your family could. And so a lot of times families would gather around and one member would read out books and newspapers to the rest of the family members. So they were still getting information even if they couldn't read it themselves. Now there are some key categories that connect various Enlightenment thinkers, but we will see how some of them differed. But overall, the Enlightenment philosophers believed that society could be reformed based on rational grounds rather than on religion, superstition, or tradition. Basically, they said, we've been doing this one way for a long time, and it's not really working. They didn't think that you should accept something just because that's the way it's already always been done, that you should question authority, you should question the system, and actually ask, is this the best way that human beings can be governed? Is this the best way human society can be organized? They also, to go along with that, argued that customary or arbitrary authority was oppressive. So what they mean by that is monarchs, kings and queens, the Catholic Church, other church bodies. They said just because they have been in charge doesn't mean they should always be in charge. And that if we don't question the institutions around us, then we're allowing these other institutions to control us. And then that can be quite oppressive. So a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers had a real problem with religion. They had a real problem with monarchies. This is all going to be very important to our next lecture talking about the Atlantic Revolution. So definitely be writing this down. And the third category is that the Enlightenment thinkers overwhelmingly believed that human happiness can be achieved in this earthly life through advancing in knowledge. That you don't have to wait until you die and hopefully go to heaven in the Christian tradition to find happiness. That you can find happiness on earth. And as you might expect, this does get them into trouble, especially with the Catholic Church, because this goes against church teachings that, at least at the time how they were teaching it, that, life might suck right now, but if you do your job and you are a good person, you'll go to heaven and then you can be happy. And the Enlightenment thinkers are saying, well, no, but you could be happy now too. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Now we're going to talk about some specific Enlightenment thinkers. There are many of them. One of the most famous is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a Frenchman, as you might guess from his name. Rousseau argued that people are born good, but it's society that corrupts them. Basically, he and many other Enlightenment thinkers argued that human beings are born naturally well-intentioned, but that society and these old institutions are so corrupt that they end up corrupting human beings, and that we should trust in human nature more, that human beings are fundamentally good. And a lot of the discussion of the Enlightenment philosophers is basically that very question of what is the fundamental nature of human beings? Are we good or are we bad? And whichever one you think we are, then that sort of dictates what kind of government we should have. And Rousseau, believing people to be inherently good, argued that institutions, traditions, etc., monarchy, religion, that has just broken human beings, and it has made some human beings bad. And that, again, if we re-examine these, we can find a more effective form of government that better suits the way he saw human nature. Now, one of the most famous is John Locke, and you must know him. Absolutely must know him. He's going to come up in our next lecture when we talk about the American and French revolutions. John Locke insisted that the sovereignty of the people came from what he called the social contract. And in his book, Treatise on Human Understanding, Locke argued that human beings are actually not really good or bad when they're born, but that we're a clean slate, and that it is poor institutions like monarchies, religious institutions, that kind of unintentionally make us bad. And he said that a ruler, a king or a queen, if they have unfettered absolute power, they always become tyrants. And that the actual best form of government is one where there's a relationship between the ruler and the ruled. And that's what he called the social contract. The social contract is between the people and the ruler. And it basically says that if a government becomes tyrannical, the people have the right to rebel and create a new social contract. That if the ruler betrays that trust of the people, you have a right to pick a new ruler. This is pretty radical in the 1690s. Because Locke is basically arguing there is no such thing as absolute monarchy. There's no such thing as divine right to rule. That the ruler only has the opportunity to rule if they do a good job. And that's fulfilling the social contract. And if the government doesn't do that, it's the right of the people to kick them out of power and put someone new in. And this is the guy who comes up with the concept of the right to govern comes from the consent of the governed. This should all sound so familiar to you because these ideas are at the very core of the American Revolution, which I'm sure you've all learned about many times, and we're going to go over it in our next lecture so we can tie it into the Enlightenment. But John Locke is at the core of the American Revolution because John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, etc., all the founding fathers read him. They knew all this. This is how they will justify the American Revolution. Without the Enlightenment, there is no American Revolution. Guaranteed. So that's why this is so important to understand. And again, you'll need this definitely to answer the prompt for this week. Now, another important Enlightenment thinker is a guy named Adam Smith. He wrote the book Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. And he's arguing also that everybody's born with the ability to reason. And that's a common theme throughout Enlightenment thinkers, that all of us have the ability to be logical, that human beings are naturally logical. And that if you appeal to someone's rationale and logic, that you can have a much more equitable society. Adam Smith also argues that you should be free to rise in society based on your merit and your talent. He's kind of the guy that's saying you should be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? That it shouldn't matter if you come from money or wealth or power. You should be able to attain whatever you want through working hard, merit, and skill. So he is also very much integral to the inception of the United States as we know it today. The United States, once it becomes the United States, will not just copy all parts of British society. As I'm sure you're all aware, there is no lord system here, right? Yes, there are wealthy people, absolutely, but there's no Lord so-and-so, Baron so-and-so, etc. That was very intentional on the part of the newly minted Americans in that they didn't want that. They wanted people in America to be able to rise based on merit and talent, and that all comes out of the Enlightenment thinking. Now, someone who disagreed, Thomas Hobbes does not believe that human beings are fundamentally good. He also doesn't believe that human beings are fundamentally clean slates. He argues that, honestly, he kind of argues that human beings, if we're just left in our natural state, that we're kind of bad. And that we need very strict institutions like government and religion to keep us on the straight and narrow. He wanted to find the answer of how human beings can live together in peace and avoid war and conflict. And he said that basically human beings, if left to our own devices, were bad. And so we should either give our obedience to a absolute ruler, or what awaits us is a state of nature that would constantly resemble civil war. Now, one thing that's really interesting about Hobbes is that his ideas about humanity are very much influenced by the time period in which he lived, which is true about everybody. But he was working in education. He worked as a tutor for wealthy families in England. But what happens is he lives through the English Civil War, a time of great instability, exactly what he's talking about. And he ends up fleeing England and sort of hiding out in France, fearing that his intellectual ideas would get him attacked by the British Parliament, which at the time was led by the Puritans, who were not a fan of any of this thinking. And even after the monarchy was restored in 1660, he wasn't safe, since many in Parliament still didn't like what he had to say. So he clearly lived in a very tumultuous period of English history, and therefore it makes a lot of sense why he would argue that only a strong leader could provide stability and that human beings had this one fundamental flaw. So it's interesting to see how the Enlightenment thinkers thought differently about the state of humanity. They're coming to obviously very different conclusions. Now, another of the famous Enlightenment thinkers is Voltaire. He was definitely one of the most fearless and prolific writers of the time in France, which at the time was not a place that tolerated differences of thought very well. He frequently mocked French leaders and aristocrats, which got him into trouble all the time, but he really saw himself as a crusader against tyranny and cruelty. In 1715, he was exiled for his behavior, but returned within 2 years, only to be arrested and sent to the Bastille, which is a big prison, for a year on the charge of writing libelous poetry. He was sent to the Bastille again in 1727 for arguing that an aristocrat, or arguing with an aristocrat, after which he hightailed it to England. He chose to live in England to avoid further persecution in France, but he was constantly fighting for tolerance and believed, quite impressively for the time period, that different religions could coexist. And for him, that meant that Protestants and Catholics should be able to live alongside each other. Now, women were also active in the Enlightenment. But the way that they were impactful on the Enlightenment had to be a little bit different, because at the time, women were not considered, almost not considered rational human beings. They definitely were not considered rational, only barely considered human beings. But as we'll see, many women decided to forge on, even though they faced great criticism. And one great example was the Marquise de Châtelet-Laumont. She was French. She was one of the few people at the time who even understood Newtonian physics, and she actually translated Newton's work from English into French, and in her translation included extensive explanations of the science that informed his thinking. So she was incredibly smart. She was a lover of Voltaire, who commented, "She was a great man whose only fault was in being a woman," which is definitely a pretty backhanded compliment. She wrote tons of books. She wrote on biology, she wrote poetry, she wrote novels. I mean, she could do it all. And here is a quote from her that I think really sums up how she saw herself. She says, "Judge me for my own merits or lack of them, but do not look upon me as a mere appendage to this great general or that great scholar, this star that shines at the court of France or that famed author." I mean, basically she's saying, don't judge me for who I'm having a relationship with, judge me for who I am. And she goes on to say, "I am in my own right a whole person, responsible to myself alone for all that I am, all that I say, all that I do. It may be that there are metaphysicians and philosophers whose learning is greater than mine, although I have not met them," which I love that sort of backhanded compliment of her own. "Yet they are but frail humans too, and have their faults. So when I add the sum total of my graces, I confess I am inferior to no one." And this is pretty radical for the 1700s, for a woman to say, judge me for who I am, not because of what you perceive about my gender or who I have a relationship with. You know, I am just as smart, I've proved myself, judge me for that and nothing else. Now we also have during the period Mary Wollstonecraft, who was an early feminist writer and philosopher. She was a translator, and she worked for a publisher who wrote radical books in London. In 1792, she published her own most famous book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in which she abhors the prevailing notion that women are helpless decorations. And that was definitely the going argument at the time, is that women were just decorations. They were arm candy, that they didn't have the ability to think critically about anything. She argued that a confined existence made women frustrated and transformed them into tyrants over their children and servants. And she argued that the key was educational reform, which was a revolutionary idea at the time. She argued that women should have the same opportunity for education as men should they want it. This caused her tremendous controversy because at the time the going argument was that women weren't rational, so they couldn't be educated. She went on to write many more books arguing the same kinds of things, but she also, for her time, is radical in that she argues that women have strong sexual desires and that it was degrading to pretend that that wasn't true, which also got her in a lot of hot water with a lot of different groups. But an interesting side note, Wollstonecraft's daughter would be Mary Shelley, who would go on to write Frankenstein, one of the most well-known and beloved books of the 19th century. Now, the Enlightenment has some massive impacts on politics. The Enlightenment thinkers are arguing that religion, scripture, is no longer a legitimate basis for government. They say human beings are rational and logical. Let's choose a rational and logical form of government. And so this is where you do start to begin to see a division between church and state. It's not immediate. It takes a very long time. But this is one reason why the founding fathers of the United States will maintain a separation of church and state, is because they were very much influenced by these Enlightenment ideals. Because the Enlightenment thinkers are also arguing, look at human beings in their natural state. Let's see how human beings are and then find a mode of government that works for that, rather than trying to force human beings into something that doesn't work. And all of the Enlightenment thinkers come to the same conclusion, that when you strip human beings of class, birth, opportunity, everybody is born equal, rational, and free. And that's a huge deal. That's also very important to the American Revolution, but also the French and Haitian revolutions, which we'll be talking about. That if all human beings are born equal, rational, and free, how can you argue that one person is better than another? Now, one thing that's very important about the Enlightenment is that the way that these men are writing about that, they're not talking about women. They're not talking about Africans. They're not talking about slaves. They are very much leaving out these groups of people. So when they say everyone's born equal, rational, and free, they mean white men. But these ideas, which become encapsulated in the American Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, other groups, women in the United States, African Americans, will use these ideas, this argument that human beings are all born the same, to agitate for increased freedom in the 19th century. So these will come back again, even though at this moment they're not being applied to everyone. Now, I want to show you an example of putting all this into practice of a leader who's considered an Enlightenment leader, and that is King Frederick the Great, I should say, of Prussia. Now, Frederick was super into reading the writings of all the Enlightenment thinkers. He was really a good friend with Voltaire. Prussia, which is now part of Germany, part of Poland, at the time was a very small territory, and he had dreams of making it bigger and better. And he would combine Enlightenment ideas with ruthless acquisition. Voltaire and the king actually co-wrote a manifesto on how the perfect Enlightenment ruler should rule. It's called the Anti-Machiavel, which is a dig at Machiavelli and his work, The Prince, which basically argued that a ruler is better to be feared than to be loved, and that the ends justify the means, and if you have to be cruel, but if it's in service to the nation, then it's fine. And so they kind of wrote the opposite version of Machiavelli's work. The whole goal, as established in the Anti-Machiavel, was to do your subjects infinite good. But Frederick wanted to do this on his own terms as an absolute ruler. Both he and Voltaire were fascinated by China, as it was being reported back by missionaries, and they thought perhaps the Chinese emperor had figured out how to rule this way through infinite good, but absolutely. Frederick of Prussia was also very into Confucianism. Again, he was very fascinated by Chinese culture, and he really liked the ideas of ruling with harmony and kindness. In order to make Prussia this amazing state as he wanted, that meant he needed to go to war with his neighbors. At least that's how he saw it. He needed a massive army, so he decreed that every boy had to be registered for the army at birth, and that all young men had to serve in the army. At any time, 1 in 20 of the Prussian population were in service as soldiers. He is widely seen as a ruthless commander who used his men a lot of times as cannon fodder. Now, interestingly, Frederick was religiously tolerant, which was truly an Enlightenment ideal, that all religions are fine, we can all get along. Prussia was largely Protestant, mostly Lutheran, but Frederick welcomed Catholics and even built beautiful Catholic cathedrals for them. So the idea here is, think whatever you like, practice whatever religion you want, just don't cause me any problems. And during his rule, he actually doubled the size of Prussia. So he admired the ideas of the Enlightenment, he's super into it, but he doesn't always put it into practice as well as I think Voltaire would have liked. But you can see on this map that he expands Prussia over into what is now Russia and through also what is now Poland. But he uses the Enlightenment to justify it, even though the Enlightenment thinkers were not arguing, hey, go to war to show everybody how great our system is. But again, that's how he will kind of justify it. Now, the last group I want to talk about is the group that intellectually follows the Enlightenment. And that's a group that are known as the Romantics. Now, far from being associated with our 2017 ideas about the word romantic, these artists, thinkers, and writers place their emphasis on imagination and emotion rather than science and reason. Basically, the Romantics argued, wow, we've just really boiled everything down to a math equation. And they said, what about feeling? What about emotion? What about imagination? And so they kind of reject all the Enlightenment order and all that kind of thing. And what they see themselves doing is attempting to capture the rare beauty of the natural world, of saying, okay, let's not try and figure out all the math equations about nature. Let's just enjoy how raw and beautiful it is. They were very apprehensive of the human world and believed that a close relationship with nature was mentally and morally healthy. Some of the most famous Romantic authors include Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, as well as Lord Byron and Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. So again, some of the most famous writers of the early 19th century fall into this category. So I always like to end here with the Romantics to show sort of this wax and wane we have as humans throughout history of being really into one idea and then rejecting it and trying something else and then rejecting that and trying something else. It's exactly what's happening here. But as I said, for our next lecture, understanding the Enlightenment is going to be paramount to understanding why the three revolutions we talk about happen in the first place.